clutch is one of those things that everybody talks about, and it's always couched in sort of wishy-washy terms because it's really difficult to nail down. And this whole piece is about trying to do exactly that, trying to quantify, figure out what exactly we can say about clutch and not just the kind of, talk that everybody bullshits about it the whole time. At the start of your piece, you kind of go through and you talk to a bunch of people, data scientists, all those kinds of things, including, PFF, Timo. And everybody that you spoke to mentioned when defining clutch, this concept of elevating play in those clutch situations, in those higher pressure situations. Is there not a good argument that actually the most important, like clutch to me is actually just not choking? Like it's the absence of choke as opposed to the presence of a greater, like his ability to close in and actually nail the ad read when he has to get it done in 6 seconds. It's more just not screwing it up, right? I don't need you to nail it. I just need you to not collapse in a heap when you're under pressure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everybody that I talked to kind of mentioned that like offhand as the possible, way that we relate to clutchness, right? That, maybe everybody gets worse, but some people get less worse, or some people maintain their level of play. And I wanted to keep that in mind while I went through this whole process. And actually, what you're saying is ultimately how it does express itself. So, there's a lot of ways to measure the quality of play. Of course, I use Pro Football Focus grades at some point throughout the piece to help kind of define the level of play, that a quarterback is demonstrating. And what I found is that in clutch moments, quarterbacks all get worse, every single one of them. Like every quarterback that I had with like an appropriate sample size, I think I ended up with 46 of them with an appropriate sample size, both in clutch moments and outside of clutch moments. Every one of them got worse in clutch moments, but a lot of quarterbacks got a lot less worse, which, accords with that understanding, right? It's not that, players get better in these final moments. It's that a bunch of other players get noticeably worse, but the way that memory works isn't really like that. When you remember a clutch moment, you don't think, yeah, man, he hit that shot exactly like he always does. You think, oh my God, he made it. That rules. Like I'm glad he did that when it counted. Right. So that's really just the way that we remember these big plays. So we tend to think of it like someone is elevating their play or
Right.
doing something that nobody would do, much less how they normally would do in these moments. And sometimes, like we remember some average players as really, killing it in the clutch. Like Robert Horry with the Celtics was like a I don't know basketball very well, but was a name that showed up in a couple of these papers about clutchness. Is like, hey, this guy was like pretty decent, but man, when it counted, he was great. And that's how a lot of people remember it, and that's not really how it tends to express itself over time. It's just most people collapse a little bit under pressure, and a lot of really clutch players just don't collapse.
And that makes sense intuitively. That makes more sense intuitively to me than the idea that pressure actually creates a better version of the player. Like to me, being an elite clutch performer in any area is simply the pressure doesn't affect you. So when everyone else gets worse, you don't, and you stay the course, and you don't do the Rory McIlroy, choke away a couple of short putts late in the final round when it's all there. Like that, you don't do that. Therefore, you win the major. Therefore, you're great and you're clutch. That makes way more sense to me than like you actually require the highest pressure moments to get the best version of that player out, which just seems like a very unlikely thing to exist.
Yeah, no, a lot of people who have talked about this have just wondered, like, why not make the whole plane out of the black box? Like, if you can be better at will, why not just be better, throughout most of the game? What's interesting is that those moments, those like oddities in terms of level of play, can trick you. I mean, it actually kind of reminds me of, I think you wrote a piece way back in, what was it, like 2013, that Tom Brady should retire or something like that. And man,
Happy anniversary.
it was frustrating because he was playing below his normal level of play, And then suddenly, late in the fourth quarter, he'd like engineer a drive and they'd win. And the Brady Patriots would continue winning games, and he's posting these poor career numbers. And you're like wondering what's going on? Is he actually getting better late in games? Why is he playing to the point where they need a fourth quarter comeback? If that feels like a very precarious position to be in, he should just play better most of the time if that's something that he's capable of. And there's like a lot of elements at play there. It turns out Tom Brady was actually still good at football. And hey, I was tricked too. I just didn't write it down for ESPN. I just wrote it for Twitter so nobody noticed. But it turns out that there are elements of play here at in football that's a little bit different than anything else, where some players might be better at 2 minute drills, which occur in clutch moments, but are different strategic considerations, right? They require a different set of talents that, Brady happens to be good at. And so I also wanted to test, like, what if you're good at 2 minute drills, but pressure is not an important element or a factor here? Like, what if the type of improvisational play that you're capable of, expresses itself well in situations where everybody kind of understands, that the ball is headed this way, that you can't spend time, that you have to do no huddle. And so I tested it against 2 minute drills occurring at the end of the half when there's not really a ton of pressure, but it is still a 2 minute drill. And it turns out that is an expressible skill. And so that's another thing we have to pay attention to is that players like Brady are just good at the 2 minute drill when there's no pressure. And so when I constructed a model for, who's a clutch player, using PFF grades, the most important factor by far was just how good are they? Like just generally, like in non-clutch moments, how good are they? And that was a huge I think it was like 7 times as important as any other element. Then the next element was how good are they at 2 minute drills, and then the final element was okay, how good are they when there's pressure? So there is some like element here where clutchness does exist a little bit. It's just so small compared to all of these other elements, including stuff that we maybe don't pay a ton of attention to, like the strategic element of being good at the 2 minute drill, which Brady was good at and tricked a lot of us in terms of his overall level of play. That, is another element here too. Like ideally someone is just good enough to just be good, and it's less that they elevate their level of play, but there are other things where it's like, yeah, they're better at no huddle than the defense is at defending the no huddle, and this is what happens.
So first off, we're not a basketball show here, but we do need to correct some misinformation. Robert Horry played for the Rockets, Lakers, and Spurs. Tons of championships.
Oh my gosh.
All sorts
That
of
is an enormous
championships.
mistake that I've made.
It's
Holy
okay.
crap.
It's okay, Arif. It's okay. It wasn't part of the 10,000 words, but the dude nailed a lot of clutch threes intuitively. Not an NBA fan here either, but I was a big Rockets fan in the mid-'90s. Hakeem Olajuwon, star. So that's the first part. I was real interested in the other sports, right? Because I think what you just laid out is the differences in football, and not just the differences in football, but the differences in the quarterback. The quarterback dictates the situation more than any other position in sports. Maybe a basketball player gets to choose his shot, so there's elements of that. But like you talked about baseball a lot in the article, in the studies that have been done on baseball and clutch, and that was one of the some of the first studies that came out were like, well, hitters can't get better with runners in scoring position. They can't get better late in the game. And it kind of makes sense. Now, as a player, you might say, oh, I'm going to change my approach. I'm going to pitch differently. I'm going to look for a better pitch as a hitter. But I do believe over time that probably evens out, right? Like you can't really will yourself to just get a hit in the best situations versus in the first inning. But as a quarterback, you do get to dictate the situation. Now, if you're down a touchdown, I need to be more aggressive. Now, that doesn't mean that your production's going to be better or that your stats are going to be better. But if the goal is binary, win or lose, being more aggressive over time, if you have 100 of these opportunities and you're playing the game, if your game theory is correct, you're probably going to win more games, right? I mean, that's part of it. In addition to, like you said, the baseline skill that you're bringing to the table obviously matters the most, right? It's like John Skelton having great game theory doesn't matter if he can't hit a throw. So anyway, I just wanted to lay that. Like, what did you see with that? The idea that quarterbacks in football, that's just different than baseball, where you can't really control the situation. In basketball, there's some similarities because, hey, the other team knows you need a game-winning shot. They're going to play you differently. But theoretically, in baseball, they're not going to play you differently, pitch you differently. Basketball, they will a little bit. But in football, like you were saying earlier, must-pass situation, things are a little bit different from a contextual standpoint.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's a little bit of a stronger effect here. The one issue is that football is just always going to be more difficult to measure because of all of the moving parts involved in football. So I think that there are some advantages here in terms of us being able to find clutch play for quarterbacks, and maybe at that point we don't even want to call it clutchness. We just want to call it another skill that they have, right? Quarterbacks that are a little bit better at unlocking that style of aggressive play, which is important because that was a problem that Aaron Rodgers had for a while. He was too afraid to throw interceptions late in games, and so he wasn't willing to make these aggressive throws. So his, passer rating in clutch moments would actually look all right, but then he wouldn't like be winning these games. And until he kind of changed his style of play, his comeback ability wasn't really there. And maybe we're constructing narratives too, but it seems like in the data that he wasn't willing to do that as much. And when you take a look at some of the guys that over that had like, mid-length careers that have been a little bit better at those clutch moments, they tend to be guys that are more comfortable with that kind of aggressive play because at some point, an interception's as good as an incompletion, right? Because it's a loss. And so if you want to generate those wins, you have to have like a little bit of like Jameis Winston, I'm just going to throw it, man. Someone's coming down with the ball. And, hopefully that means a touchdown for somebody. And certainly it's going to end the game, right? Losing by 14 is the same as losing by 7. So sometimes, that is like an element of play here. That was certainly a huge problem with Kirk Cousins. I cover the Vikings a lot, and Cousins would play like the exact same style of football late in games as he would early in games when the situation wouldn't call for it until his final couple of years in Minnesota, which notably he had a different coach. He had Kevin O'Connell, who was, anecdotally, or if we want to create a narrative around, these coaches, probably a lot less concerned about Cousins making these mistakes, probably a little bit less neurotic than Mike Zimmer was about the quarterback, throwing a late interception, because sometimes that's just what you got to do.